Uche's first memories of the church were filled with comfort. The warm, uplifting music, the gentle clapping of hands, and the smell of incense and starched Sunday best. When he was a young boy, no more than 7 or 8, he would watch from the front pew as the elders strode down the aisles in their pristine robes, swaying to the choir's melody. Pastor Matthew Oho would preach at the pulpit with thunderous passion, punctuating his words with bursts of spiritual fervor. Even then, Uche recalled how the entire congregation seemed entranced by the man's commanding presence. Over a decade later, at age 20, the church still held a strong sway over Uche's life, though the comfort he once felt had long since faded. The church in question was Life Eternal Ministries, nestled in the heart of Lagos. Whitewashed walls bore posters about upcoming revivals, worship nights, and guest speakers. Sunday mornings were always a spectacle, where well-dressed families pulled up in cars or strutted in on foot, hopeful smiles on their faces. But these days, Uche found it difficult to join those smiles. A persistent knot of unease lodged in his stomach whenever he crossed the threshold into the church compound. He felt like an intruder in a place he once considered a second home. Mama Uche, a petite woman with warm eyes and skin that had grown rough from years of struggle, never missed a service. A widow for 5 long years, she scraped a living selling oranges and peanuts at a small roadside stall. Between that and volunteering at the church, she barely managed to keep food on the table. Her deep faith and unwavering commitment to Life Eternal Ministries had given her a sense of purpose after her husband's tragic passing. The pastor and elders had offered her consoling words and occasional assistance. "God will provide," Pastor Matthew used to say, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She believed him wholeheartedly. He was a man anointed, after all, performing charitable works and offering scholarships to needy youths. Many members of the congregation held him in high esteem, calling him a shepherd to the lost. So, when Pastor Matthew handpicked Uche for special youth mentorship, Mama Uche was convinced that fortune had finally smiled on them. She thought, "Surely the Lord is answering my prayers through this man." Uche, for his part, nodded politely when his mother urged him to attend the late-night prayer meetings and training sessions with the pastor. He wanted to be supportive. He wanted to see his mother smile. At first, it was innocuous enough. Pastor Matthew would call him aside after service, speaking in hushed tones about leadership in the church. He praised Uche's diligence whenever the young man mopped floors or carried heavy boxes of Bibles. "You have a strong back and an obedient heart," the pastor would say. "God will use you mightily." Those words glowed in Uche's chest. He had always yearned for fatherly guidance, especially after losing his own father so young. In the early days, he even looked forward to those one-on-one sessions. But soon, something began to shift. It was a Wednesday evening when Uche first felt that distinct tingle of dread. He had been summoned to the pastor's private office after choir rehearsal. Rows of religious books lined the walls, and a portrait of Pastor Matthew shaking hands with a famous evangelist hung behind the desk. The air smelled faintly of cologne and dust. "Lock the door," the pastor said, voice calm but commanding. Uche obeyed. He could sense an unease inside him, but he shrugged it off as nerves. Pastor Matthew began by asking questions about Uche's personal life, his mother's finances, whether he had a girlfriend, how often he prayed. Before Uche realized what was happening, the pastor's tone grew more intense. He launched into a lecture about spiritual obedience, weaving scripture after scripture to highlight his authority. "You must trust me," the pastor said, leaning forward, his eyes bearing into Uche's. "To follow God's path, you must be tested. I will guide you. Only I can see the darkness that clings to you." After that night, the demands escalated. At first, it was just the pastor's odd insistence that Uche keep their mentorship sessions a secret. Then came intrusive questions about Uche's body, and the pastor's laying on of hands lasted uncomfortably long. Eventually, under the guise of spiritual cleansing, Pastor Matthew crossed lines that left Uche feeling ashamed and violated. Uche would return home with red-rimmed eyes, refusing dinner. Mama Uche was worried, but chalked it up to stress. "This is just the devil trying to distract you from your blessings," she would say, cradling her son's head in her hands. He could never muster the courage to speak the truth. If he shattered her faith, what would remain? Yet each new session became more humiliating. Each new betrayal, cloaked in biblical language, made Uche feel smaller and more powerless. Worst of all, Pastor Matthew would remind him, "No one will believe you if you try to speak against me." One humid Saturday night, the city's power supply had been cut for hours. The entire neighborhood was dark, lit only by lanterns and the occasional flash of a headlight. Uche had been mopping the church floors in anticipation of Sunday service when Pastor Matthew called him into a storage room. That evening, he demanded more than ever before. Uche's pleas to stop fell on deaf ears. By the time the locked door finally opened, the 20-year-old staggered out, clothes torn, tears burning his cheeks. He felt dirty, shame sizzling through his veins. Mama Uche found him huddled against the wall of their one-room apartment, rocking back and forth, eyes glassy. He told her everything in a broken voice, sobbing into her lap. She struggled for words, her heart pounding as though it would burst from her chest. At first, she refused to believe it. How could a man of God commit such evil? But seeing her son so shattered forced her to face reality. Horror and rage mixed in her heart. Every bit of respect she'd ever held for that pastor was obliterated in one searing moment. It was close to midnight when Mama Uche whispered, "We must tell the elders." Her voice trembled with fear. She knew deep down the risk they were taking. Pastor Matthew was wealthy, influential. He had the ear of businessmen, politicians, and numerous high-ranking church officials. Still, a mother's love surged. Cradling her son's trembling form, she promised, "I will fight for you, even if it's me against the world." The following day, Mama Uche sought out Elder Bassi, a man known for his stern demeanor and unwavering loyalty to Pastor Matthew. Her heart pounded as she recounted Uche's testimony in hushed tones, praying the elder would react with compassion. Instead, Elder Bassi's face hardened. He shook his head, uttering words of doubt. "Sister Uche, do you realize the gravity of what you're saying? Pastor Matthew is an anointed leader. Accusing him of this unimaginable sin, is slanderous." Her pleas fell on deaf ears. Before she could protest, Elder Bassi began lecturing her on the dangers of the devil sowing lies within the congregation. "The enemy is using your son's mind against him," he concluded, all but dismissing her outright. Undaunted, Mama Uche went to other deacons. Each time she was met with disbelief or thinly veiled threats. Some warned her, "If you continue, you could be excommunicated for bearing false witness." Others whispered rumors that maybe Uche was seeking money, trying to blackmail the pastor. The more she pushed, the more walls sprang up around her. Uche watched it all from the sidelines, sinking deeper into despair. The church seemed to transform into a fortress of hostility overnight. Friends who once smiled at him from the pews now gave him suspicious or pitying looks. Overnight, he had become an outcast. Just when it felt like all hope had evaporated, the first crack in the church's wall of denial came in the form of a gentle woman named Reverend Grace. She was a junior minister, recently transferred from another branch of Life Eternal Ministries. She had noticed Uche's withdrawn behavior, the bruises on his arms, and a haunted look in his eyes. One afternoon, Reverend Grace quietly approached Uche as he sat alone on a bench in the courtyard. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He didn't speak at first, fear pooling in his gut. He expected her to chastise him, to call him a liar, maybe even threaten him. Instead, compassion radiated from her gaze, and tears he had fought to hold back came flooding out. Over the following weeks, Uche and his mother confessed the entire harrowing story to Reverend Grace, who listened without judgment. She promised to help them, but cautioned them to move carefully. Pastor Matthew has more power than you realize, she explained, her voice tinged with sadness. Still, she offered a crucial lifeline. An old friend named Barrister Chibueze, a lawyer who occasionally took on pro bono cases to help victims of abuse. Through clandestine meetings at Reverend Grace's modest apartment, they began gathering evidence. Uche documented every text message the pastor had ever sent him, and Reverend Grace covertly collected testimonies from other youths who might have had similar experiences. Late into the night, the trio pored over these details, hearts pounding with fear and determination. Every shadow that flickered against the window felt like a threat. Every muffled sound of a passing car made them wonder if someone was watching. Yet they pressed on, forging a fragile plan to expose Pastor Matthew. Word spread that Pastor Matthew had traveled for a month-long evangelical crusade in Port Harcourt. The congregation buzzed with rumors of miraculous healings and financial blessings that followed him. They awaited his triumphant homecoming with bated breath, eager to welcome back their spiritual hero. For Uche, the days crawled by in a haze of dread. He knew that once the pastor set foot in Lagos again, everything would come to a head. Either they would succeed in bringing the truth to light, or Pastor Matthew would crush them beneath his influence. On a sweltering Sunday morning, the church was packed. Women in vibrant head wraps and men in their tailored suits fanned themselves against the heat. The choir rehearsed uplifting hymns, anticipating the moment Pastor Matthew would ascend the pulpit. Ushers scurried around, trying to keep the aisles clear. Amid the buzz, Uche stood near the doorway, drenched in sweat. His heart thundered against his ribcage. Mama Uche gripped his hand firmly. Beside them, Reverend Grace bowed her head in prayer. Hidden among the congregation was Barrister Chibueze, calmly observing the proceedings with a focused gaze. Then came the moment. Pastor Matthew entered, flanked by church elders and a swirl of camera flashes. Applause exploded in the room as he strode to the front, a dazzling smile on his lips. It was the face the world knew, a benevolent, compassionate leader. Uche's stomach twisted in knots. Pastor Matthew began his sermon, voice booming over the microphone, weaving tales of his crusade's success. He spoke of lost souls found, the hungry fed, the sick miraculously healed. His oration was electric. Many in the congregation were moved to tears. It was easy to see why this man held such sway. His words were laced with passion, his presence radiating confidence. Halfway through the sermon, however, a commotion stirred near the entrance. Heads turned. Two uniformed police officers made their way down the aisle, escorted by Barrister Chibueze. An ominous hush rippled through the crowd. Pastor Matthew paused mid-sentence, brow creasing. The elders exchanged alarmed glances. From his vantage point, Uche could see the pastor's eyes narrowing. For a split second, confusion flickered there. But then recognition set in, and a faint, guarded expression took hold. "Sirs, may I help you?" Pastor Matthew asked, a practiced calm in his tone. He still held the microphone, his voice echoing across the hushed congregation. One of the officers stepped forward. "We are here to request that you come with us for questioning regarding allegations brought by Mr. Uche Okoro and additional witnesses." Gasps rippled across the pews. Some people stood, craning their necks to see better. Others sank into their seats, looking shocked or skeptical. The sight of a man so revered being approached by the police was almost unthinkable. An undercurrent of tension charged the air, threatening to erupt into chaos. Pastor Matthew's knuckles whitened on the microphone. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he forced a laugh, tinged with a hint of desperation. "There must be some mistake," he declared to the congregation. "Satan is at work here." But Barrister Chibueze stepped forward, voice steady. "There's no mistake, Pastor. We have testimonies, messages, records. You will have your chance to defend yourself in court." The scene that followed was equal parts surreal and heartbreaking. The elders tried to block the officers, shouting that Pastor Matthew was innocent, that this was a ploy from the devil to destroy a righteous man. A few congregants sobbed openly, while others glared at Uche and Mama Uche with open hostility, calling them liars or gold diggers. Yet, amidst the turmoil, a contingent of worshippers slowly rallied around the trembling mother and son. Reverend Grace stood beside them, tears in her eyes. Some in the congregation remembered witnessing odd behavior from the pastor or had heard rumors whispered in the corridors. They began to wonder if this was, in fact, the truth finally surfacing. Within minutes, the church was no longer a place of serene worship, but a battleground of beliefs. The pastor was led out, flanked by police officers who had to navigate furious parishioners and stunned onlookers alike. Cameras flashed, capturing his stiff expression. Outside the doors, the press, alerted by Barrister Chibueze, began to swarm, shouting questions. That night, the entire city talked of nothing else. Social media erupted with heated debates and claims of innocence or guilt. People took sides, some vilifying Uche and his mother, others praising them for their courage. For the first time in a long while, Uche felt something stir in his chest that wasn't just fear. It was relief, tinged with the faintest hope. The subsequent weeks were a blur of legal appointments and media coverage. Mama Uche discovered a new reservoir of strength within herself as she stood by her son's side. The initial sense of betrayal and terror began morphing into fierce determination. She would see this through, no matter the personal cost. In court, Pastor Matthew arrived with a high-powered legal team. He wore a solemn expression, occasionally shooting withering glances toward Uche. Fear crept up Uche's spine whenever their eyes met, but he held his head high, supported by Barrister Chibueze's unwavering guidance. Several other young men and women came forward, some openly, others through sealed statements, alleging patterns of abuse under the guise of spiritual cleansing. Each testimony added weight to the case. The once invincible pastor now faced mounting evidence that painted him in a sinister light. Still, it was no guaranteed victory. Money and connections whispered in every corner. Rumors circulated that bribes were being offered to key witnesses. The intimidation tactics were relentless. Men in suits showed up at Mama Uche's stall, asking too many questions. Anonymous phone calls threatened retribution. Posters supporting Pastor Matthew sprang up around the neighborhood, proclaiming his innocence and championing him as a martyr. Yet, with each passing day, the scales inched closer to justice. Barrister Chibueze and Reverend Grace remained staunch allies, reminding Uche and his mother that giving up would only embolden the abuser. Several months later, the case was still ongoing, but there were signs of progress that could not be ignored. The court had begun to acknowledge the weight of evidence. A date for a more formal hearing was finally set, igniting cautious optimism in the small, stuffy apartment where Mama Uche and her son waited for updates. By now, Uche had begun seeing a counselor recommended by Reverend Grace. Slowly, through tears and haunted memories, he was learning to process the violation and shame that once defined him. Mama Uche sold her fruits and peanuts with renewed vigor, head held high despite the sneers she sometimes received. A few neighbors started offering words of encouragement, testament to the community's slowly shifting perspective. On one particularly bright morning, as the sun's rays filtered through the dusty windows, Uche found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. He realized that speaking out had brought him out of the shadows, no longer forced to suffer in silence. Though the journey to healing was far from over, He no longer walked it alone, and in a small room lined with legal documents and well-worn Bibles, a mother and son prayed, not for miracles conjured by human hands, but for the steadfast power of truth. Whether or not Pastor Matthew would ever fully confess his crimes remained a question for the courts. But for now, Uche understood a crucial victory. No matter how powerful one man might seem, a single quiet scream, once spoken aloud, could echo until it sparked a movement toward justice. In that revelation, Uche found the faintest glimmer of peace. A seed of hope had been planted where once there was only despair. And for the first time since stepping into Pastor Matthew's office all those months ago, he felt he could finally breathe. Free from secrets, free to reclaim his life, one day at a time.